The 2023 championship table tells one story, but points are far from the best way to rank the Formula 1 drivers. Every year, the F1 team at the race sticks its collective head above the parapet to risk angering, or perhaps even delighting, the dedicated fans of every single driver to create its own ranking. This is based solely on their 2023 performances relative to the machinery. It's not a ranking of the overall ability of the drivers to say who is best and worst, but evaluating how they did over the 22 Grand Prix weekends. So this factors in everything from qualifying speed and racecraft to number of mistakes and consistency and every other metric in between. And it reflects not the opinion of one individual, but the race's whole team of F1 journalists. 22. Nick De Vries. De Vries' long-awaited F1 break didn't last long, as he was dropped by AlphaTauri after just 10 races. It was certainly a harsh and impatient decision, but ultimately, had De Vries made a bigger impression behind the wheel, he could have hung on to his seat. The AlphaTauri was at its worst in the first half of the season, struggling with late entry instability and rarely a points threat. But De Vries only outqualified Yuki Tsunoda twice in 12 attempts, including the 2 sprints, and failed to score a point. 21. Logan Sargent. Sargent showed flashes of genuine speed. The trouble is, these were rarely strung together and he made too many mistakes, which makes it impossible to rank him any higher. He scored just 1 point for 10th place at Austin after 2 cars ahead were excluded, and was outqualified by teammate Alex Albon in every single session. Albon was a tough benchmark, but as Oscar Piastri proved, rookies can be expected to perform better than Sargent did. Sargent improved as the season progressed, with Las Vegas probably his strongest weekend, as he qualified 6th and then had a solid race. But next year, he must string things together more often, or Williams' patience will run out. 20. Zhou Guanyu. Zhou made a step in performance in his second F1 season, but not by enough. He only outqualified teammate Valtteri Bottas 6 times, and despite the occasional eye-catching performance, such as a remarkable 5th on the grid in Hungary, he too often struggled to get the most out of the car over a single lap. The Spanish Grand Prix was his standout weekend, taking 9th in the race, but there were very few events of that calibre. The trouble is that having made a promising start compared to Bottas last year, he wasn't able to build on that enough in 23, so it's a case of must do better next year. 19. Kevin Magnussen. Magnussen only appeared to turn up for the street circuits, with all 3 of his points for 10th places on such tracks in Saudi Arabia, Miami and Singapore. The rest of the time, he couldn't extract anything like the qualifying pace Nico Hülkenberg did from the car. That's because he struggled badly with its turning characteristics and wasn't able to attack the corners on the brakes. As he put it, the Haas turned characteristics in my driving style that are strengths into weaknesses. Given the Haas was a tyre degradation nightmare, there wasn't much more Magnussen could have done in the races, but fundamentally his hopes of scoring on orthodox circuits were sunk by his poor qualifying pace. That's despite the fact that in the races he performed better relative to Hülkenberg than he did in qualifying. 18. Daniel Ricciardo. The returning Aussie only had 7 events to make an impression, which was interrupted by the hand injury that led to him missing 5 weekends. And while he wowed with a superb Mexican Grand Prix weekend, the rest of his part season wasn't up to that standard. Generally, Yuki Tsunoda had the edge in terms of underlying pace, even if that didn't always show in the timesheets, and that's something Ricciardo needs to reverse next year. But what really mattered was that Ricciardo was not the pale shadow of a driver he was with McLaren in 2022. So while Ricciardo doesn't rank highly here, and he would have been further up with a full season, it was mission accomplished for him as he revitalised his F1 career. Now he needs to build on that in 2024. 17. Lance Stroll. Stroll's season started with hugely impressive grit and determination as he finished 6th in Bahrain despite no pre-season testing and injuries sustained in a cycling accident. That kicked off a solid run in the first part of the season, albeit falling well short of the standard set by teammate Fernando Alonso. But as the Aston Martin evolved, Stroll struggled with rear-end instability that shattered his confidence. That led to a difficult sequence of 5 pointless weekends after the summer break, a run that included missing the Singapore Grand Prix after his qualifying crash. However, Stroll recovered to finish the season with a run of 3 strong races, taking 5th in Brazil and Las Vegas, then a point for 10th in Abu Dhabi. 16. Valtteri Bottas. It was difficult to make a good impression given the Alfa Romeo was, on average, the slowest car. But Bottas's best work was genuinely impressive, notably his well-executed 2-stopper to take 8th in Bahrain and a repeat of that result in Qatar. He also turned in several good performances in pointless causes such as at Monaco. There was plenty of bad luck too, notably at the first corner in Las Vegas where he started 8th on the grid. However, there were also a few too many weekends where Bottas seemed a little off his best. That's what hurts his ranking and potentially denied him a few more points in what was a difficult season. 15. Liam Lawson. Lawson transformed his career by seizing his stand-in opportunity, which should ensure a full-time F1 seat down the line. Unfortunately, as he only had 5 weekends to make an impression, that denies him the chance to be ranked higher. After coping well with being thrown in at the deep end in the wet at Zandvoort, Lawson made a big impression in the following 3 events in Italy, Singapore and Japan, taking his first F1 points for 9th at Marina Bay. His stint ended poorly in Qatar, and that's by Lawson's own admission. As he said, "It's pretty disappointing to finish my run of races like this." 14. Nico Hülkenberg. Were this ranking to be based solely on qualifying, Hülkenberg would be much higher. The trouble was that despite reaching Q3 8 times, it was usually much tougher on race day. That was thanks to the rapid tyre degradation experienced by the Haas VF23, but Hülkenberg did seize a couple of opportunities, taking 7th in Australia and 6th in the rain-hit Austria Sprint thanks to a switch to slicks. Generally, he was on a hiding to nothing on race day, and that made it very difficult to make a good impression. But he comprehensively outperformed teammate Kevin Magnussen. All things considered, Hülkenberg did a good job, but in very difficult circumstances. 13. Sergio Perez. To rank Perez so low would have seemed inconceivable after his superb start to the season with wins in Saudi Arabia and Azerbaijan. Unfortunately, that form proved unsustainable. The simple fact is that when you're in a car capable of winning 21 out of 22 races, but you only manage to be in the top 2 in qualifying 6 times and finish on the podium 9 times, it has to be considered a mediocre season. As Perez himself put it, "It's been dominant for Red Bull, but it was quite tough for me." Yes, Perez finished 2nd in the World Championship, and it's well known that he struggled with the handling characteristics of the car for much of the season. But the simple fact is that he had the opportunity to do far better than that. 12. Yuki Tsunoda. Tsunoda had by far his most consistently strong season in F1, having the edge on pace over all 3 of his teammates and almost taking AlphaTauri to 7th in the Constructors' Championship. In particular, he was impressive early in the season, when the AlphaTauri was at its worst, finishing 10th or 11th in the first 5 Grand Prix of the season. Later in the year, when the car was more competitive, he scored points in 3 of the final 5 events. The trouble was that there were still mistakes. He was excellent in Spain, save for being suckered into forcing Joe off track and earning a penalty that cost him a points finish. Then in Mexico was on a charge he believed could have netted 5th when he turned in on Oscar Piastri. Then there was the spin early in the race at Interlagos. But overall, he made a good step forward and was 2nd best of the 5 Red Bull drivers. 11. Esteban Ocon. At his best, Ocon was outstanding. He was the star of the Monaco weekend, taking a stunning 3rd place and produced great performances in Saudi Arabia, Spain, Canada, Singapore and Las Vegas. However, Ocon was a little erratic, and over the second half of the season, he seemed to lose the initiative to teammate Pierre Gasly, who was usually the quicker of the pair. Ocon bemoaned his bad luck in the later stages of the season, and it's true he had some misfortune, but the overall trend in his teammates' favour means he just misses out on the top 10. 10. Pierre Gasly. Gasly started the season a little ill at ease with the characteristics of the Alpine, but still managed to be nip and tuck with teammate Esteban Ocon in terms of performance. The pair stacked up almost identically on average qualifying pace, with just 8 thousandths between them on average, albeit in Ocon's favour. But once into the second half of the season, Gasly started to assert himself, both over Ocon and in terms of steering the car setup direction. While his headline results were 3rd places in the Spa Sprint and the Dutch Grand Prix, his best work was probably late in the season, notably a superb Austin weekend to take 6th, as he potentially set him up to be Alpine's spearhead in 2024. 9. George Russell. Russell characterised 2023 as probably one of the worst seasons of my career in terms of results. He described it as a really scrappy, messy season. And he was right to say that because he made too many errors, notably the off at Monaco that cost a podium, crashing in Canada, hitting the wall on the last lap in Singapore and colliding with Max Verstappen in Las Vegas. But there was also plenty of good too. On outright pace he was evenly matched with Lewis Hamilton, and he also had some bad luck, notably in the Australian Grand Prix where he was undone by a red flag, then an engine failure. It was still a good campaign in terms of his performance, but one that just didn't come together as it should have. And Russell has to carry some of the blame for that underachievement. 8. Oscar Piastri. Piastri's rookie status means he's judged a little differently to the rest. As you'd expect, his was a season of peaks and troughs, but overall he showed himself to be seriously quick and completely at ease at this level. Right from the start, the speed was obvious, even when it didn't always result in stringing together a good qualifying lap. But after some low-profile but impressive performances early on, he really started to make an impression once McLaren introduced its season-changing upgrades. He deserved his first podium at Silverstone, but lost it to safety car timing, and later bagged a 2nd and a 3rd place, as well as victory in the Qatar Sprint. His main deficit to Lando Norris was on race pace, and that's something he accepts he needs to work on, but his rookie season is a brilliant foundation. 7 Carlos Sainz. For 3 events after the mid-season break, Sainz was the best driver in F1 with an overachieving 5th place at Zandvoort, pole position and victory in Singapore, then 2nd at Monza. There was plenty of good work supporting that, but generally Charles Leclerc was marginally the faster Ferrari driver. There were also patchy phases of the season for Sainz, with a bafflingly bad weekend in Baku, a costly mistake at the final standing restart in Australia and a tough finale in Abu Dhabi. But overall he did an excellent job for Ferrari and caused plenty of problems for Leclerc. 6. Alex Albon. Albon single-handedly took Williams to a lucrative 7th in the Constructors' Championship, consistently dragging the best from a car that was one of the weakest and most erratic on the grid. He scored 27 of Williams' 28 points and was by far the strongest driver across the season of those in the 4-team group at the back. As his ranking here reflects, he was one of the best drivers of the season, given that so often to get those results he had to put in drives that defied competitive gravity, such as in Canada where he held off the faster Ocon. Save for Australia, where he crashed out of 6th place, he kept mistakes to a minimum and has attracted the attention of plenty of rival teams as they consider their 2025 driver lineup. 5. Lewis Hamilton. Hamilton came close to finishing 2nd in the championship off the back of what was more a series of consistently good race performances than reaching the heights that he is capable of. That's because of the capricious Mercedes W14 that prevented him from doing his best work. By his own admission, qualifying was often a struggle due to the lack of confidence in the rear end of the car. There were moments when that improved, notably in Austin where he was superb but ultimately excluded for illegal plank wear, but on single lap pace the 2 Mercedes drivers were evenly matched. Like the experienced pro he is, Hamilton rarely had genuinely bad weekends. Qatar, where he turned in on Russell and eliminated himself from the race, was the low point, and despite his head regularly dropping, he kept racking up the points. But he had a subdued end to the season with 8th in Brazil, 7th in Las Vegas and 9th in Abu Dhabi as he was counting down the days until he never had to drive the W14 again. However, on the rare occasions when the Mercedes worked well, he reminded everyone the magic is still there. 4. Lando Norris. While there are legitimate question marks over his qualifying errors, as Norris himself made very clear on several occasions, Norris excelled on race day in 2023. That earned him 7 podium finishes, but not that elusive first victory. Piastri was able to push Norris in qualifying. That said, the McLaren was also a tricky car, so it's difficult to unravel how much Norris's series of qualifying errors were down to him and how much were down to the inevitable challenges of driving a knife-edge car on the limit. However, for all that, Norris was still overall the quicker driver in both qualifying and, in particular, on race day. Over race stints, he had the clear advantage in terms of tyre management when degradation was a challenge, regularly taking the best possible result. 3. Charles Leclerc. There's a perception that Leclerc only really hit his stride in the closing stages of the season, and it's true he was at his outstanding best once Ferrari introduced a floor upgrade at Suzuka that made him much more at ease with the car. But there was more to his season than that final third of the campaign. Although there was a spell when Sainz had the advantage thanks to the car having to be set up with an understeer balance, Leclerc was comfortably the stronger Ferrari driver overall. He had a strong start too, performing well in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, but undermined by reliability problems and grid penalties. And although there were occasional bad weekends, notably Spain, Miami and Australia, there were also 5 pole positions and a string of excellent race drives. 2. Fernando Alonso. Alonso made a mockery of Alpine's concerns about his age by performing superbly for Aston Martin, taking 8 podium finishes and producing some of the most intelligent and well-executed race drives of the season. The way he outthought Perez for 3rd place on the final laps at Interlagos typified what Alonso delivered on race day, and he remains one of the most innovative and improvisational drivers in battle. And even when the Aston Martin was off it, such as at Monza, he still dragged what he could from it. There were a few occasions when his frustration got the better of him, notably with a difficult Mexico weekend, and he made an uncharacteristic misjudgment in the first corner at low grip Las Vegas, but by and large he was a consistent force. And but for a few hundredths in qualifying, or a switch to intermediates rather than slicks at the final pit stops, he might have won at Monaco. 1. Max Verstappen. Yes, the Red Bull RB19 was the dominant force, but Verstappen used it to exquisite effect to win 19 out of 22 races. The comparison with teammate Perez was proof that simply sitting in an RB19 wasn't enough to guarantee a string of wins. Verstappen's ability to handle a fast but tricky, pointy car bears comparison with Michael Schumacher, and it was that capacity that allowed Red Bull to extract increasing pace from the car. He was also masterful when it came to tyre management, efficient in qualifying even when tyre warm-up troubles meant that others were stronger and rarely made mistakes. Being at the front made it easier for Verstappen, but it was everything he did to get there and the way he made the most of every opportunity that made his season a brilliant one.